All right, hello, welcome everybody to the 2016 Fall MTS. I'm delighted to be here. Since I'm running MTS this semester, I guess I'm introducing myself. I'm Jeff Yoshimi. I'm an associate professor in the Cognitive and Information Sciences unit here, and I'm delighted to be running the seminar series this semester. So let me give you kind of a big picture overview of what this talk is going to be about. It's sort of two things. I'm going to introduce the speakers for the semester, and I'm also going to talk about this kind of book project I've got going. And the big picture is that, we've got, the common good, so cognitive science, citizen science, and the common good. In terms of pursuing the common good and addressing social problems like access to healthcare or climate change, any of a wide variety of social ills, those are in a sense problems, and they get better when people solve them, right? These are problems to be solved. And when somebody solves a problem, right, they're using their brain together with some kinds of instruments usually to come up with a solution to it. So, common goods are sort of dealt with by humans with their brains finding solutions to problems, thing that Daniel and I have been talking about. And so this makes sort of a lot of social problems fall in some sense under the rubric of cognitive science. In particular, we can think about, as cognitive scientists, how can we optimize the coupling between human brain solving problems and the machines that we interact with and the tools that we interact with to solve those problems. And also, what's the best form of AI? So AI is a sort of classic cog-sci topic. What's the sort of optimal form of AI and machine learning to couple to, so that with these distributed systems of human brains together with AI systems, how can we sort of perhaps accelerate the pace of solutions to some of these social problems? I'm going to focus, for reasons that will be clear shortly, on disease as a social problem, and in particular cancer. And of course, there's many kinds of cancer. It's sort of misleading to talk about cancer or a cure to cancer when it's really a very complicated family of biological problems. But just for convenience, I will say cure to cancer. I'll say things like that. Okay, and I'm going to focus even more particularly on citizen science and kind of what you could call gamified citizen science. Citizen science is broadly the involvement of non-professional scientists in scientific activities. We've been having interesting discussions about this on the discussion board. And one approach to involving non-professional scientists in science is creating different kinds of games. This is Aterna, this is Foldit. And in these games, they're kind of fun. They're not fun the way like a first-person shooter is fun, really. They're fun maybe the way Sudoku or chess is fun. So they are, I enjoy them. So you play these games, and the top players in these games actually end up sort of contributing new drug designs in some cases. So players in these games could end up contributing, to cures for diseases potentially. All right, so let me start by giving thanks to Paul Gleshko and Pamela Samuelson. So their foundation has been funding the MTS seminar series since about 2008, and to the School of Social Sciences, Humanities, and Arts. Actually, we forgot to celebrate last year. It was 10 years last year that we've been doing MTS. It goes back to 2005 when Teenie Matlock started it. This is my third time running MTS. I guess that makes me an old timer. It's been great. Again, we're very grateful to the Gleshko-Samuelson Foundation. They've been very generous in their support, and it's allowed us to bring in a much greater diversity of speakers from a broader array of places. All right, so as I said, this talk has twin goals, again, to describe this sort of big synthetic project I'm working on, and also to introduce the seminar series. So here's the lineup, and my plan is, as I go through my talk, there's going to be this sort of blue thing around a given speaker, so I'll be able to say how that speaker is sort of doing something related to this project I have, and then you'll see a little bit about what that speaker's up to. And a lot of the stuff will be, I've got my project of, curing disease with citizen science, but a lot of the material will be independently of interest to this group, right? So talking about, for example, innovative ways of gathering data. On this talk in particular, the day after it, we're going to have a symposium. It's going to be called Metaphor for the Common Good. And so this is going to be different people. There's a lot of people here who work on metaphor. There's a lot of discussion of, say, how you frame a social issue, the kinds of language you use can promote greater engagement in it. So we're going to have a number of people out here. So Teenie, Flussberg, and Thibodeau, and a few others going to be here. We're going to have a roundtable discussion that Tuesday. And actually, this is the CogSci for the Common Good is part of a bigger thing Tina and I have been talking about, and now CIS as a whole has been looking at. We're kind of looking at maybe once a semester doing something on this general theme of ways cognitive science can contribute to the pursuit of various human goods and common goods. All right, so I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background on the topic, why I'm interested in it. And then I'm going to give you lots of background on cancer. This is actually almost the full half of the talk is going to be background. Some of the statistics, the biology, the history of cancer research, and a little bit of the sort of metaphor research that's related to this. It's a giant field, and it's just been, it's a lot. It's fascinating, but there's a lot of information out there. And then, as a philosopher, I've got an argument with premises and a conclusion. So I'll give you the argument and try and defend the argument. I'll talk a little bit about games and citizen science and some future directions. All right, so some preludes and caveats. First of all, in any academic paper or presentation, what is my intellectual contribution, right? What's new here? Primarily, I'm going to be synthesizing existing research. So it's mainly sort of packaging a lot of stuff that a lot of other people have already done into a coherent argument. I think there's some great ideas out there. There's some great stuff happening, but I don't think we have quite, I think there could be greater numbers. And through greater numbers, I think we could have greater acceleration, in particular, towards a cure for cancer or various treatments of various kinds of cancer. So I'm primarily kind of packaging existing work in a new way. So framing it with an explicit argument. I do have some ideas for some games and visualization ideas. So Tim and I have been talking about this. A few others I know are interested in this. And then at the end, I've got a few other things, special sauce in there. All right, and caveat, so this is a lot of material. Sorry for the, did you guys go to the other room? Yeah, sorry about that. So I'm covering a lot. So I've been into this for a couple of years, for about 3 years now, and I'm learning history, I'm learning biology, I'm learning metaphor theory. There's a lot of experts in the room on metaphor theory. And so in phenomenological terms, you could say that my horizon on this is narrow. So if you've got a rich horizon on some topic, it means you're really comfortable with it, and from any point in the discussion, you could follow the discussion anywhere. Like if you're teaching something, you've taught it 5 times, any question comes at you, you could handle it, no problem. You could follow the discussion there. When the horizon's narrow, it's like you've just cleared out one little path through the woods, and if I get pressed a little in any direction, I might not have the answer, particularly in biology. Are there any biologists in the room? Okay, all right. Well, you can call me on stuff. The YouTube audience will comment on the mistakes I make. I might not know the exact mechanism of a particular Gleevec or something, of some particular cancer treatment. So that's just sort of, I'm hedging my bets here. This is a lot of material and it's very new to me. This is a new project, it's just a couple years old. All right, so I think this is the personal part of the presentation. This is what motivates my interest in this topic. I'm not going to advance the slide yet, it's a little painful. So my sister-in-law got diagnosed with cancer in 2012. In 2013, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. She had calcifications, and it did, she could have gotten checked. So I encourage you, be aggressive with your doctors, get your checkups. They said not to worry about it, and then, 6 months later, it had metastasized locally to the breast and to some of the lymph nodes nearby. This is around the last time I ran MTS, actually, this was happening. She got the surgery, and then, like 4 months of chemotherapy, and then like 6 months, a number of months of radiation after that. And so actually the last time I was doing MTS, I would have the speaker here on Monday, and then the rest of the week I'd be in the chemo room working on cognitive science stuff. And so all these things are kind of mixing in my head as I'm going through this. She's fine, she's fully recovered. Her sister passed away. She waited a little too long, she was young, to get her colonoscopy. And maybe if she had caught it a few months earlier, she would have been all right. So please, it's not pleasant getting a colonoscopy, but when the doctor says it's time, I encourage you all to do it. So here's some pictures. This is her in the midst of chemotherapy. This is her and her sister who passed, and their mom. All right, so that kind of got me interested. Cancer is a tragic disease. It's got a random component to it. I mean, there's stuff we do that sort of increases our odds of getting it, but there's this underlying randomness involved in it. You know, this year alone, actually all in January, David Bowie, Alan Rickman, and Grizzly Adams, they passed all in January, and I suspect everybody in this room, maybe some of you are cancer survivors, maybe you know cancer survivors in your immediate family, you know people who died from cancer. I would bet that everybody's 2 steps removed from the tragedy of cancer in this room. So it's this terrible thing. It was very emotional, and I thought, well, you know, I'm studying things related to this. You know, what could I do? You know, there's this helpless feeling you get when you go to the doctor's office. You know, they're busy. This is a whole separate topic of dealing with doctors in this kind of situation. But, you know, you really, you know, you want to take charge. You want to fix it. You want to solve it. We're problem solvers. I started off with that, right? We evolved to solve problems. You know, out there in the bush, you know, we're making spears and nets, and we're figuring out, here's a problem, let's solve it. And I was thinking, well, could we solve this problem? What could I do? How could cognitive science, you know, what could be done about this? And around that time, I started learning about citizen science, and the game Folded in particular, and that was sort of the origins of this interest of mine. All right. So some of the basic statistics here. I think my motto for cancer statistics has been, there's no one-line summary, right? Unless it's a very long line with a lot of ands in it, right, and qualifications, right? If you're talking about a specific type of cancer in a specific place, specific time, specific group, then you could get something. Or another way of thinking of it is like, you want a graph? I got it for you, right? You tell me the graph you want, and we'll find conditions to get that graph. So, I mean, for example, incidence of melanoma, the number of people getting it, this is American data since '75, has gone up, right? So more people are getting it. So, you know, tens are nice, but, you know, take it easy. On the other hand, incidence of cervical cancer has gone down in the same period, largely because of improvements in pap smears and related technologies, so detection. Testicular cancer is an interesting one. Incidence has gone up for reasons that are not understood, but mortality has gone down, and in fact, it's essentially thought of as a cured cancer at this point. Chemotherapy is very effective. Even if it metastasizes, your chances are pretty good with testicular cancer. So there's a lot of variability. If you aggregate overall cancers, at least in the American data, incidence, you'll see this is sort of a depressing one, it's kind of flat, right? So it's not a huge overall improvement, although mortality's gotten a little better, and I think this reflects the aggregate impact of various scientific advances in particular types of cancer. All right, so some lessons out of this. First of all, it's a big problem, all right? I think, you know, qualitatively, I don't want to ask for a show of hands, but I think we could all agree. I really do suspect we all know somebody. You know, here's some basic statistics on that. Expected to be 13 million deaths by 2030. Maybe we could change that number. So it's a problem. It's clearly a social problem we want to do something about. You know, it's no fun to face the idea that you could get cancer at any time, or when your loved ones could die at any time from this. So clearly, I think I've motivated to claim this is a problem. But it's not like this is an unsolvable problem, all right? It's not like, you know, dealing with this problem, it's not like asking to be able to, you know, go back in time or levitate in midair or travel through walls, right? I mean, you know, maybe it's okay to look at that a little bit, but those are pretty pie in the sky moonshots. Whereas I think I'm going to try and give you a sense that there are mechanisms responsible for various kinds of cancer, and there's technologies out there now that suggest that we could make progress on it. It's an addressable problem. All right, so it's a big problem that we can make progress on. Now, it's worth pointing out that the biggest return on investment to date in cancer, the reasons a lot of the stats have gone down, for those that have gone down, are very low tech, right? Just stay out of the sun, don't smoke, take it easy on the alcohol, you know, don't, you know, if you're a gourmet, you know, I know you like to sear your meat, but, you know, it could just be a little brown, right? Don't blacken it, all right? So figure out what the big carcinogens are. Just stay away from nuclear waste. You know, don't stack the odds against yourself. Better detection technology, right? You know, get your colonoscopy on time and so forth. So, I mean, it's important to keep that in mind. I'm going to be talking a lot about actually once you get it, how do we kill it? And I am going to talk in those terms, violent terms. That is the enemy. I hate you. I want to kill you. All right. So I'm going to focus on that. But separately from that, right, you really should think about prevention. That's a big part of it. And this is the first speaker I'll mention. In the last week, Susana Ramirez from here at UC Merced is going to be talking about how people's understanding, like how different groups of people have different understandings about cancer, right? So some groups maybe think cancer is always going to be fatal, you're going to die, and then they have that misinformation that could lead to problems, right? So she's going to talk about ways to sort of improve the information transfer from what's known about cancer to the various communities it affects, which is an interesting, that's a cognition, distributed cognition kind of problem. All right, so focus on treatment, I think that's the biggest ROI there, but in some cases treatments are possible. As I said, testicular cancer is considered by some to be treatable, some kinds of leukemia, some kinds of breast cancer. So that's what I'm going to focus on. You know, how can we accelerate progress in that? Once you find out this terrible news that you've got it, are there things we could do to make it more likely that there's something that can be done to attack it? All right, so let me give a brief primer on cancer biology. I think we all know from high school biology, so your body's made out of cells, and in the middle of the cell is a bunch of DNA. All right? And DNA is a long string of information in this 4-letter code. All right, what is it, GCAT, I think? So you've got these 4 letters that get, you know, written out in a long string, and then substrings of that are genes, which get turned into proteins. They get transcribed into RNA. There's a few extra steps in there I'm skipping. The RNA exits the nucleus of the cell, and it goes to the ribosome, where this little sort of, you know, string of information, this transcribed RNA, gets translated into protein, which is written in a 20-letter alphabet, right? There's these 20 amino acids that get put together in a certain sequence, and you get this long string of amino acids, and then they fold into this complicated little shape. All right, so I think of genes as like little programs for proteins. They're little mini protein programs. And proteins are these extremely complicated nanomachines. We've got about 20 to 25,000 genes in the human genome. And I think of it like there are these little choppers and cleavers and receptors and locks and keys that interact with each other. And I think of like the old Radio Shack catalogs. You know, they have those big catalogs. If you've ever seen Mauser Electronics, maybe some of the nerds in here, right? So you get these big catalogs with different kinds of, like, here's 5 pages of you know, choppers, and here's 20 pages of doors, and here's 30 pages of different kinds of scaffolding, right? All the stuff you need to build the biological system, you've got this big catalog of it, and each cell has this catalog, and then gene expression, right, it's pressing, think of there's like a button on each entry in the catalog, so I'm mixing metaphors here, right? So you know, as genes are expressed, these buttons are getting pressed, and proteins, these little nanomachines, you know, okay, we need more of this receptor, we need more of this kind of actin, right? It's pressing all these buttons to create these little nanomachines. All right, so the cell as a whole is this very interesting kind of soupy computer is how I've been thinking of it. It's got some kind of, it's like this, it's not like this kind of computer where it's all kind of dry and clear and laid out. It's these paths of chemical reactions that are happening in this 3-dimensional medium that's incredibly complicated. So this is a picture of a cell signaling pathway. That's a tiny fragment of the many pathways that are out there. And so you can see, you know, there's all kinds of gene regulation happening in the nucleus, right? Which genes are being expressed at what time. I used to think DNA just kind of sat there inert until reproduction happened, right? But it's not, right? It's little bits of it get exposed. This is where epigenetics comes in. And then, you know, it's very actively playing a role in your body at all times. And then these sort of sequences of chemical reactions that could be represented in this kind of a network diagram occur. And they're very complicated, and actually, I'll get to this at the end. I think this is probably the level, there's pretty good educational material out there now for those interested in sort of education psychology, for like macromolecules and proteins and the stuff on the last slide. Here, I think we're lacking. I think we could do a lot more to make this stuff more accessible. This is about the best you got right now, is like this picture. All right, so then what goes wrong with cancer? So now I'm going to mix metaphors. I like tuning metaphors, right, and reversing metaphors. I think of cancer as a series of bad jackpots. So it's like you hit the jackpot, but it's bad news when you do, all right? It's like negative jackpot, all right? So DNA damage and mutations are happening all the time, all right? So you get things like, you know, you get this is an ASCII code instead of the 4-letter DNA code. You get a deletion, I am a code, to I am a cod. All right, so that happens, and many other kinds of damage happen all the time, right? This is a soupy medium where it's not just, you know, physically stable, and so problems happen, and so we've evolved all these mechanisms to kind of fix the damage as it occurs. And it's not just in the DNA. Scott was pointing this out the other day. There's many other places that problems can happen in the process, in translation, for example, to the protein. So the way I'm thinking of this metaphor is, think of it like there's these slot machines. We'll just do press button slots, all right? And every time you press the button on the slot machine, if you get a jackpot, damage happens, all right? So think all of your cells, all the time, a certain number of times a minute, are playing the slots in there, right? They're the penny slots in Vegas, all right. We're playing the slots all the time, right? So this is the randomness. There's this background chance you might get a bad jackpot, but luckily for you, there's other things that are like looking for problems, fixing them, right? But then those things could break, right? So then you get 2 bad jackpots, and if you get the wrong sequence of bad jackpots, your cell goes into self-replicate mode, and then you've got cancer, all right? Now notice, the buttons are being pressed, all right? You're out there, I don't know how to work this metaphor quite, all right? You're at the penny slots in Vegas on Friday, and they come around and you do something like you smoke a cigarette, and now you get in a tanning booth, you get really drunk, and then it's like you got some drinks now you're right smoking the cigarettes. Now the cells playing the slots a little more, right? So use this in your head every time you're doing something bad, right? You think, my cells are now hitting the machines a little more, and I'm more likely to get cancer. All right. So again, if you get a bad jackpot, you're probably all right. If you get another one, you're probably all right. But if you get the wrong sequence of them where the damage occurs, then the thing that fixes the damage also breaks. When something like that happens, you can get cancer. So I think of it, again, if you've ever seen this machine, not that I go to Vegas much, but I have some dim memory of this. This is one where if you get like this jackpot, if you get like the Wheel of Fortune here, then they spin the Wheel of Fortune, and then if that thing hits, then you get like whatever, $1 million or something. So that, right? I mean, people aren't getting cancer all the time, but they get it a lot. It's a big problem because there's lots of us out there with lots of cells doing lots of bad things, unfortunately, so the slots are being played a lot, and just the way the numbers work out, we get a lot of cancer. All right, so that's my mental model, and so now to bring in another image, does anybody recognize who the creator of this is? Spit it out. Who is it?
Rube Goldberg?
Rube Goldberg, yes, right? So, this is I don't know when it was, the 40s, this is like a thing that when you open the paper, it eventually serves you your egg or something. Through all these crazy kind of contraptions. Well, I mean, that's a lot like what's going on with cancer. That's sort of how I'm thinking of it. In the soupy computer, there's lots of these little sort of gizmos are talking to each other. And if the wrong sequence of steps happens, again, you get this sort of uncontrolled cell growth state. And what we want to do is find ways to intervene. And it's so suitably complex that there's lots of different ways to intervene. There's lots of money put into cancer research. We're trying out lots of drugs, and our bodies are adaptable, so most of them don't work. But again, this is this addressable problem. There are things that can be done. And so what we need to do is take our evolved problem-solving tools that we have in our cranium here and apply it to this problem. We don't want these cells to get stuck in self-copy mode. We want to kill them or block them or prevent them from getting in that mode in the first place. And again, prevention is the first thing. Find tumors early, don't smoke, don't drink too much, get your tests. All right, so I think we need to attack this problem once we do get it using our cognitive problem-solving skills. All right, so let me now give you a little sense of the history of cancer research. And this relates to the theory of conceptual metaphors, which we have actually quite a few. We're sort of turning into a center of this, I think. We've got Juana and Carrie and Teeny and others. So we've got experts in this very room here. So the easy way to think of conceptual metaphors is it's the idea that in our cognitive system, in our conceptual system, we often think about more abstract things in terms of simpler things. So a classical example would be, argument is war. So we think of this abstract thing, argument, in terms of this more sort of primitive thing of conflict with others. So you defend an argument or you support your position. Love is a journey. Love is an abstract thing. Walking along a path or taking a trip is a concrete thing. The number line, right? The number line is an abstract thing, but left and right in front of us is a very concrete embodied thing that we all have an immediate understanding of. So we've got these kinds of cross-domain mappings in our brains from sort of more basic, grounded, embodied kinds of experience to more abstract things. And you could think of the mind as a kind of set of these metaphorical mappings. It's very interesting stuff. And as I've been researching this, the history and then the metaphor theory are coming together in quite a few interesting ways. And we're going to have a few people talking about this over the course of the semester. So the metaphor for the Common Good Symposium I mentioned in week 9 with Flussberg and Thibodeau and Tini. And then in week 10, Wanda's going to be talking to us about sort of data mining large corpuses for to look at how the how various cancer metaphors are used differently by different groups. So very interesting stuff. All right, so I'm going to focus on bellicose, belligerent, violent metaphors for cancer. I think violent confrontation is a sort of primeval, basic thing, right? We're getting into it with our brothers and sisters and siblings. We've all got drama, right? Everybody's, you get into arguments with people. There's, maybe not, I don't know, you're not reacting to that. Maybe I got drama, I don't know. I think some of you, maybe a little bit, there's things going on. All right, we understand it, right? We understand what it is to have conflicts with people. And so, and we understand what it is to have a collective enemy, like the Nazis or something, where there's a problem out there that you want to get rid of, all right? So that's a very clear source domain, and I think it's a valuable source domain. This is a little controversial to use when sort of framing my argument. So I like the metaphor of the war on cancer. That's my position. The metaphor itself has a long history in English. I'm going to focus on the American data here again. Although I think that this is Google Ngram. I think this is actually, this is whatever Google has. So there's 2 spikes in it you could see, and I haven't done a sort of serious data analysis on it, but I've sort of spot checked, and it's fairly clear what's going on. So the first one is associated with the early history of the American Cancer Society, which at the time was called the American Society for Stopping the Spread of Cancer, something that had this really long, unhelpful name. And a woman named Marjorie Illig created what she called the Women's Field Army. To address it, there was not a lot of information about cancer out at the time, and cervical cancer was the #1 killer at the time. This is before the Pap smear had been discovered. And people were dying, and there was not a lot of good information out there. And she, it's interesting stuff. She's explicitly framing this in terms of these, we need to marshal our forces and get out there and attack this enemy cancer. And it was very effective in the early years. And this sort of morphed into the, holding the sword there, the icon for the American Cancer Society. So this is all between the 30s and the early 50s. In the later part of this period, a woman named Mary Lasker got involved. She was married to a guy named Al Lasker, who was sort of an important figure in the history of advertising. He was an ad man, sort of Mad Men kind of guy. And she was kind of a socialite who was tied in with lots of different, political groups in the United States. And she went in there, and so somebody she was close to died, and then her husband, Al Lasker, died of cancer. And so she said, she walked into this American Society for the Preventing Cancer, I forgot the name of it, and said, look, what's going on? How are you using, what's your money going to? She went in there and sort of shook things up a little and said, what's going on? This name is terrible. We need a more marketable name. American Cancer Society, that's better. And then she organized, she was like a smooth Aryan, right? She was a socialite. She went out there and got people into it. So it shows there really is this kind of political side to medical research. And so she sort of marshaled all these forces, got people together, and it was through her efforts and others, but she was one of the main figures, that the National Cancer Act in '71 passed by Richard Nixon. So it was in the Nixon administration this happened, and you can see around that time you get this real spike. Actually, the initial legislation did not have the phrase war on cancer, but it was associated with it. Some of the press surrounding it had that phrase, and it's sort of since it's been reaffirmed in the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, there have been various reaffirmations of the war on cancer. So this is a controversial metaphor. There are problems with it. So first, there's a lot of interesting stuff I've been reading about the story of anytime there's a big national act, it's a big political process. And so there was all the backstory of the National Cancer Act of '71. And Rettig, who does not like it, he said, there are people who said this is kind of, the money's going to the wrong place here. First of all, it's like, there was this bad analogy with the space program, like, getting to the moon. This is just a discrete thing that we could just do. But curing cancer is not like that. It's not just something that could just happen like that. As I said before, right? There's many kinds of cancer, and it's more incrementalist, right? It's pretty you know, the idea that we're just going to put a bunch of money into it and end it is unrealistic, especially at that time. And there was also this idea that the funding that was sort of apportioned through the Act was sort of not proportional to the probability of success. Again, the biggest successes of cancer have been low tech, right? Sort of, you know, making people get tested, you know, reducing the number of people who smoke. California, you know, is one of the world's best places for that, actually. So why are we going to put all this money into these low probability of success things versus these higher probability success things? And actually, more recently, in the actual conceptual metaphor literature, there's been a little bit of work that framing things in this kind of pugilistic way may inhibit self-limiting behavior. So it may discourage people from thinking about limiting their, you know, smoking less or drinking less alcohol, and just focus more on just sort of taking a pill to attack this problem. So all right, so those are some, I guess, some of the downsides of the metaphor. On the other hand, it's a very clear attention-grabbing source domain, as I've already tried to say. I think it's very clear, you know, I think we can sort of rally around this problem. It makes us angry that people are dying in this kind of random way. You know, it sort of packages my argument as I'll try to motivate in a clear way. This should be much clearer in a few slides. And here again, there's sort of the other side of the Hauser and Schwartz paper is that there's some work in climate change that when you frame things neutrally as an issue versus more metaphorically as a war, that people perceive greater risk and are more willing to engage in that domain in conservation behavior. Also, you know, source domains can be shaped and tuned. I've actually been reading like these military strategy books, right? For not because I want to do military stuff, right? But you know, for the conceptual value of it, right? To motivate people to think about this problem in a specific way. I don't know, I always liked military games and gaming and chess and football, you know, the two teams. I mean, I think it's just, there's something very clear and crisp and, again, attention grabbing about it that I think we could harness in the pursuit of this problem. All right, so here's the promised argument. It's a very simple argument. It's an optimization argument of a kind. It's all right, if we want to maximize progress in the war on cancer, right? Or if we want to minimize the incidence and maximize the mortality associated with various kinds of cancer. Did I say that right? We want things to get better with cancer, all right? What do we need to do? Well, we need to get as many people thinking about the problem as possible. So we want to maximize solver hours, so more people thinking about this problem more of the time. And so we want quantitative superiority, all right? So that's like supposed to be a massive army. This is the nerd army I want to rally, right? The army of problem solvers, right? I want to marshal forth this army. We want to maximize their power. We want to equip these guys and girls, you know, we want to equip this group with the most powerful weapons possible so that, you know, every hour spent thinking about these problems is as effective as possible. So we want to get these two quantities as high as possible. So conclusion, we should max out these quantities however possible, and I'll talk about ways of doing that. And I've got a kind of backup plan here. So suppose we did this and, you know, thousands more people than already do sort of participate in these various citizen science activities. Even if no new cures are forthcoming, I think there's value in the effort nonetheless, particularly in terms of scientific literacy. So that's kind of the fallback here. All right, so how do we do this? How do we max solver hours? How do we get more people thinking about these problems? Well, first note, I mean, again, continuing the military metaphor, there is kind of a base army at work on the problem. So there are people who are paid for their time to think about how to find cures to cancer. And I think many people here, may possibly, you know, Sandy, my wife, is alive because of the efforts of these people who've already come up with better treatments, all right? So in academia, of course, federal funding goes to all the various cancer research that happens, not just in America, of course, around the world. This is Jonas Salk, who effectively cured polio, or made it treatable, and, you know, the namesake of the Salk Institute in San Diego. And of course, in industry too, so Genentech is responsible for a number of drugs like Herceptin and Avastin. There's problems with this. Stuff is very expensive. Nonetheless, in terms of the people out there who are thinking about this, who are applying their brains to this problem, there's already a fairly large group of them, a large sort of existing army of problem solvers working on the problem. Now, there's questions about this, about how things should be funded, about the ratios. there's a lot of questions surrounding this and legislation around funding of cancer research and so forth. But I'm sort of thinking of that as a separate problem. I want to focus on what could we do, right? What can, right now, after this class, what could you do that could contribute to the effort to find new cures to cancer? And in fact, there are things that we can do right away. And sort of medium terms, I think there are new kinds of citizen science approaches we could take that could accelerate progress. So I think we could expand the auxiliary force, as it were, the volunteer force. So auxiliaries have always played a role in war efforts. Maybe some of you are military historians who know more than me. I know in the Roman auxiliaries were a central force. This is the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, which was very large and influential in the Battle of Britain. The Civil Air Patrol still exists here. I think my daughter used to go up in at Castle Air Force. All right, so she was an auxiliary member of the Air Force. So all right, so I think we need something like that, an auxiliary force. But the question is, how do you get people, if you're not paying people to work on this, how do you get unpaid volunteers to work? All right, and the answer, I think, is to use non-standard incentives. So the incentive, right, if you've got a common enemy, this is of course World War II, then that's your motive, right? You're not doing it for money, you're doing it to defeat this enemy, this thing that is killing us. All right? It could actually, some of these games are kind of fun, again, not like a first-person shooter fun, but like Sudoku fun. There's sort of competitive aspects to this game, and there's other actually non-standard incentives also. And so this general area is sometimes called crowdsourcing. All right, there's a number of things here. We've been having I've been very impressed, by the way, with the grad student discussions of this matter. It's been very stimulating. I've enjoyed the discussion. Crowdsourcing generally is efforts to address a problem by getting a lot of people involved for some of these non-financial motives. And I think my favorite example is CAPTCHA. I think everybody recognizes this, right? The reCAPTCHA thing. So the idea there was the common good to be pursued there was to digitize the Library of Congress. All right, so they used optical character recognition, but optical character recognition fails a certain amount of time. So there was a whole list of words that they could not translate with OCR. So what they did, Louis von Ahn came up with this, is he made this system where in order for you to get to the next stage of a website, you've got to prove you're not a robot by translating two words. One of the words is a control where the computer knows the answer already. And then if you're correct on the control and enough people are correct on the sort of, the treatment, I guess, the unknown one, then they would count that as a translation of that word. And so in this way, humans would devote a few seconds of their time motivated to just get on a website. And this is the sort of jujitsu redirection of energy, right? From that sort of effort, it got redirected into this public good of digitizing the Library of Congress. Nowadays, I think it's translating like addresses on houses or something, so it's not quite that, and Google owns it, so it's a little more, the ethics of it a little less clear at this point. But I mean, the principle should be clear, right? We're taking one motive structure to get to sort of make an advance on another problem. There's various competitions, the hackathons, DARPA's grand challenges, and so forth. These are a great way to, invest a little money and sort of get a competitive thing going. Open source software, this is another classic sort of crowdsourced type of thing with its own literature, and there's a lot of interesting work in there. And then citizen science, which I'll talk about more later, all right? And in week 5, Darren Brabham from USC is going to come up and talk about some of these issues. Again, very interesting discussion. What is the line between crowdsourcing and crowdsploitation, as it were? When does it become exploitative? A lot of us here use Mechanical Turk, right? What is the ethics of that, for example? So I think independently of my project here, there's interesting questions there. All right, so that's how to max out, I'm arguing, number of solvers. How do we get, maximum solver power? All right. Well, traditional solvers have all this stuff in wet labs, which we don't have. I mean, that's changing a little. There's like this biohacking stuff out there now. All right. But for the most part, the Citizens Auxiliary Corps doesn't have access to that stuff. But we do have personal computers, which are increasingly powerful. All of us are doing. Most people here do some kind of machine learning, AI type things. You'll do it in my class in spring if you take it. So those I think are the relevant weapons to use. We've got this complex domain biology, we've got this complex set of signaling pathways, and I think we could use various kinds of AI to kind of come up with new approaches to fighting disease. all right? And I think the place to start here is what would be the optimum? What's the best possible coupling between human and machine? And there I think, so Adolfo, I'm glad you did the Padawan thing here. You know, Luke and C-3PO is probably a good example if you're not a, yeah. Do you guys know this? He's got the Padawan thing, and then when he gets his dissertation, he's going to cut it and become a Jedi. So we want that to be short, right? All right. If you don't like Star Wars, so you could Janeway and the hologram, or Plankton and Helen. So I mean, you know, in every one of these cases, you know, what do you do to interface with the computer? You talk to it, right? The human or the plankton in one of these cases, you just say, look, what is the probability that this will happen? You know, here's the biological situation. What's the known literature on this? What does the known literature suggest we could do, right? You know, I'm considering these 5 options. What are their relative probabilities of success? You know, just ask the computer, right? Ask data, and data just tells you. So that's kind of the optimum. We're not there yet, but we're getting closer, right? We can Google things, we could talk to Siri. And so I think we should get as close to that as possible, and that often will mean sort of, you know, visually immersive, visually suggestive versions of AI. Not AI where you're spending a lot of time sort of coding, but you sort of want to maximize the interface between the human and the AI system that the human's using. So these are some examples. This is like a Bayesian network where you just, you know, you set things just by clicking buttons and entering numbers. This is Google's TensorFlow, which I've got mixed reviews on, but at least it takes it and you can do this big, giant, deep learning thing just by dragging things around. This is my own SimBrain here, which takes neural networks and allows you to sort of see the nodes and the activities in a very direct way. And this is a little preview of Foldit, which I'll talk a little more about in a second. And Foldit, I think, really illustrates what I'm talking about here. So in Foldit, you actually grab, this is a protein, a model of a protein, and this number up here you want to maximize. And once you get past the threshold, you win, okay? And so what you do is you sort of, as a human computer, move things around, and as you're moving it around, you see the number change. So you're like a human optimizer on this problem, this protein folding problem. But at various times, you could press these buttons, like wiggle all, wiggle backbone, wiggle side chains, and then the computer takes over, the AI takes over, and it's sort of moving around, and you see the numbers start to go up more. So you get this kind of, you know, you're doing it, and then you're having the AI work on it, and then you're doing it, and so you get this back and forth kind of cycle. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. You might not know a thing about mathematical optimization or backpropagation or simulated annealing or whatever they're using. All you know is there's a button there that when I press it, you know, that helps my score go up a little more, right? So it's very easy to use. So anybody, even without a machine learning background, could take advantage of it. All right, another sort of strand of AI that's relevant here is what's sometimes called computational scientific discovery, sometimes called automated scientific discovery. This goes back to the early days of AI. You know, back in the 50s, it was a big, exciting thing. We've got computers now that could simulate human cognition. We've got the computer model of the mind. And well, science is something humans do, so maybe we can model scientists. We can model scientific cognition. And so we can make AI systems that help humans do science. In fact, this was conceived of as a human-machine symbiosis, so this early kind of proto-cyborg literature. And some examples from this literature was like Bacon, a sort of famous early AI system that discovered the laws of science. You gave it a bunch of celestial data, and it by itself came up with Kepler's laws, and similarly for like the ideal gas law, I think. So Pat Langley was the big name in that. There was a lot of work on automated theorem provers, right, where you address a logical problem. You sort of make a computer that could do logic, and then you have the computer try and solve things. There's a famous example of Principia Mathematica, this giant 3-volume thing that took, you know, years and years for Whitehead and Russell to prove all the, it's funny, it's like pages and pages to prove that 1 + 1 is 2, right? But it put math on this logical foundation, and then they made a computer that reproved all these theorems in like 15 minutes or something. And there's interesting stories there. You know, I think they tried to submit a paper, this is relevant to the discussion on the boards, that was like where the author was the computer to the Journal of Symbolic Logic, and they said, no, you can't do that. And they had systems that helped with scientific tasks, like analyzing mass spectroscopy data. And all of this stuff has lingered, right? There is still computational proofs are still out there. There are things that are only proven because of computers' helps. Clearly, you know, spectroscopy is something that's assisted by computers today. And there's really kind of a whole galaxy of approaches to what, there's no one name for it. Discovery informatics, computational discovery, the stuff that Langley's still around and doing stuff. So there's all this stuff in this area, and within that, an especially promising area, I think, is something called causal discovery. And we're going to have a few speakers on that come. So just to give you a quick sense of that, in causal discovery, which is one thing coming out of this older computational discovery literature, there's this problem where you've got a bunch of random variables, and you know they're correlated, but you want to find the underlying causal structure. For example, you know, you take a bunch of measurements of the angle of depression of a pedal on a car, the speed of the car, and then the reading of the speedometer, and they're all going to be correlated, right? When one goes down, when one changes, the others change. But from that, how can we figure out the sort of direction of causation? How can we figure out that when you press the pedal, that's what makes the speed go up, which is in turn what changes the gauge? Well, we could intervene in a specific way. We could just change the gauge and notice that it doesn't change the other two, for example. So this is all fairly simple in this case, but what about when you have tens or hundreds or even thousands of random variables and you want to try and infer the causal structure among those? Well, this is an expanding area. There's been a lot of work on it in the last few decades that's ongoing. And we're going to have a few people talk about this. Next week, Fred Eberhard on Tuesday is going to give a talk on it, and then in week 8, Benjamin Jansen. They're both former philosophers of science. And to give you a sense of the use of this, you might have a bunch of data about a signaling pathway, right? Where you just all you know is, you know, some observations about these, and there are automated algorithms to go in and tell you, look, this is what the most likely causal structure is. Or, look, if you do these 5 experiments, then we will be able to determine what the causal structure is. So you're not just doing hundreds or thousands of experiments, you're doing very targeted sequences of experiments. So here again, independently of my interest in, you know, trying to cure cancer, this should, I think, be of independent interest to many of us here. All right. So visualized AI is sort of what I have in mind for the maximizing solver power, all right? So now let's put this all together, right? How do we package this into, you know, big crowdsourced games that give you access to AI? And here I think the visualization in games are where it's at. I mean, it just never ceases to amaze me how much people could do with a video game without documentation, right? You don't have to consult the rules to figure out how to use a lot of computer programs when they're well designed. This is an old Don Norman cognitive engineering point, right? If the system is well afforded, you don't need documentation. That should be the motto, right? No documentation required. Okay, so he's like on a car, you know, the little seat adjustment. If it's got a little picture of the seat, then you just immediately know how to use it, right? It's well afforded. Well, I mean, I think good games are a lot like this. This is a game called Monster Physics, which illustrates the idea that without documentation, we could learn to intervene in a physical system and solve problems in a physical system, even if you're 5 years old. So this is my daughter last year. And so this is called Monster Physics. If you have kids, I encourage you to, I don't know what your policy is on technology and kids, but if you allow them access to the iPad, let them play this game, I encourage it. The way this works is there's these friendly monsters that eat things, and there's a bunch of fruits, and they're set up in some initial configuration, and you've got to figure out from a palette of objects how to change the physical system so that all the fruits get eaten. All right, so here she is. Okay, so she's, I think, putting a rocket booster on one of these wheels, and then runs a simulation, and all of the fruit gets eaten, and then you get this reward. Congratulations, you made it. The dopamine squirt, it feels good, and you go to the next level. Okay, so this is a huge area, right? These kinds of gaming and education, right? There's another galaxy of areas, right? So there's visualization in general. There are the learning sciences, which is, I guess, Memphis is maybe the center. I learned about you, Rick, so I'm relying on you here. You know, in learning sciences, it's a lot of, you know, it's these specific hypothesis tests, like do people learn more when you get a detailed picture of a heart, let's say, or a line drawing of a heart? And people actually do better with a line drawing because it abstracts out the unnecessary information. There's all the acronyms, there's UX and HCI. You know, in Chris's MTS last semester, we had some very interesting talks about UX. What was interesting there is how they'll run just experiments like in a day, right? Just to figure out, you know, how do people do better, which arrangement of keys or whatever on an interface. There's interaction design, Umesh is doing interesting work in these areas. There's gamification, which is kind of using game techniques in various non-game arenas. Cognitive engineering, which I mentioned earlier, which is associated with Don Norman, where you really think of the mind in connection with artifacts as a kind of extended cognitive system, and you think about these as information processing systems and think, how do we design the object for the most effective form of interaction? And I think these are separately interesting again to us, but in terms of my argument, this is where I think cognitive science has something to contribute, right? How do we take all the knowledge in all these areas, and cognitive engineering, this is one of your IR topics, is cognitive engineering, right? You're all going to think about this. So how do we use that kind of knowledge to make how could we use that kind of knowledge to make citizen science games that could accelerate the pace of the pace of a cure? So we're going to have a lot of people coming to talk about things in these various areas. So in week 3, Tessa Verhoff's going to come. She's got some very interesting work gathering data that's kind of embedded in games. In week 4, Evan Suma Rosenberg, who's an expert in virtual reality, is going to come. I think one of his students is like a billionaire now through Oculus. His student, I think, started Oculus, which was then acquired by, who acquired Oculus? Facebook. Yeah, okay. So his students are doing pretty good. Emily Treat is with this organization called Games for Change. It's looking at all these ways you can sort of affect social change through games. Amy Ogan is an expert on education technology and educational games. And Lillian Davila at week 13 is somebody here from UC Merced who works in materials science, and she's got a big immersive VR rig that she uses to look at these carbon, I guess, microtubules or nanotubules, and she's looking at ways to design, for example, improved drug delivery systems. And just using your human intuition in this immersive 3D environment allows and facilitates scientific discoveries that would be difficult otherwise. All right, so let me get to some of the actual games. The two that I've been most interested in are Aterna and Foldit. So in Aterna, the goal is to improve RNA structure prediction. So you've got, again, this 4-letter alphabet. It's not GCAT, it's GCUT, I think. And the goal is to be able to say, given a particular sequence of nucleotides in a string of RNA, what shape will it fold into? All right? And moreover, if we had better principles, and it's an unsolved problem, right? Lots of these cases are known. For many cases, they do know what the folding structure will be, but for many cases, they don't. And if we had better principles for this, we could then do RNA design. We could say, look, here's one stage in the Rube Goldberg cancer process. This is what's going wrong in this type of cancer that's making it occur. If we had a drug that was this shape, if we had a particle that was this shape, it could interfere with one stage of that process. And if we could engineer RNA to conform into that shape, then we could come up with a new drug that we could try to use to target the disease. And so that's the goal of Aterna, is to sort of improve RNA structure prediction and design. And I'm very impressed with it. It's really well scaffolded. You don't need directions. You go in and little balloons are popping up telling you what to do. It's really pretty fun. It's very determinate, right? You just use these 4 different colors for the 4 nucleotides, and you try, like there's a target structure here. This person is failing right now to get the target structure, and so you change the colors until it goes into the right shape. And the early stages are just vetting you, right? It's like, if you're just sort of passing their pre-packaged tests, you're sort of rising up through the level as your score goes up. You start off like you ranked 75,000, and if you just pass level 1, you like go way up like to 50,000, and it feels really good. You see it scroll by your rank. And then I'm up to like 9,000 something. I'm very excited. And when you get to the very top levels, the top few hundred players, those players are working on structures that have not been solved yet. All right, so then they'll all propose solutions. They will collectively vote on those solutions, and then the top voted ones get sent off to a lab, and they're actually synthesized. And then the information from that goes back to the players, and the players' rank goes up from this, so they get sort of more weight, I think, in scoring. And they actually improve. They've got their own internal AI that is trained in part by these players' activities. And so in week 7, one of the creators of Aterna is going to come, Riju Das, and one of the top players. I'm excited about this. He's a OChem student at Fresno State, and if his lab doesn't conflict with the MTS time, he's going to come and I think give us a demo of what a top Aterna player looks like. All right, and it's very interesting. At the top levels, there's like this community that is having these sort of self-contained discussions about the best way to do these things, and so it's a sort of new form of scientific subcommunity. So here it is. It's a quick little demo of it. Somebody going through and changing the nucleotide sequence. It's very nice. You get the happy little sounds when it goes well and bad sounds when it goes wrong. All right, folded is very similar. Here the goal is not RNA structure prediction, but protein structure prediction. So again, with protein, you've got a 20-letter alphabet, and you know, the shapes it could fold into are much more complicated. This is also called the protein folding problem. So given a sequence of amino acids, what shape will it take? Again, it's not completely understood, and again, by understanding it better, proteins could be artificially designed to intervene in various chemical and biological processes. Here, it's similar to Aterna, but it's not as discrete. So you don't see the individual amino acids directly. You see these more like secondary and tertiary structures, like alpha helices and beta sheets. I think these are hydrogen bonds here. And there's a lot more of this embedded AI in it, right? That as you progress through the levels, it unlocks more tools where you could automatically wiggle the side chains and so forth. So it's got a lot more of that like C3PO, you know, you've got your droids you're interacting with flavor to it. And it's got a very active community, and it's actually organized into teams. We're looking at like how do you allocate scientific credit when something is discovered through one of these. And one of the papers, it's like the top winning team was one of the co-authors of the paper, right? So a group of people who sort of solved one of these problems. You could also build your own scripts, and then share scripts or not. You could keep them to yourself, where it'll be, you know, you sequence together these AI kinds of things where you wiggle side chain for 10 iterations, then add a rubber band here, then wiggle the backbone for a certain number of iterations, and so forth. So let's see, in week 14, the creator of Folded's going to come, Seth Cooper, or at least one of the creators. Let me see, I think I have a video. Okay, so that's what it looks like when you're playing it. As it's pretty intensive on the processor. As I said on the boards, the fans come on right away. And actually, people will, like I've seen people, like the top players will sort of crowdfund their own efforts and say, look, I need a more powerful computer to cure disease. Will you give me money? I'm a top player. So it's very interesting stuff, very interesting new forms of scientific community. All right, so that's the big picture. So we want to rally a big army of problem solvers and equip them as best as possible, I'm arguing. Where do I want to go with this? Well, first I want to package it into sort of a popular book that kind of promotes some of this. I think, at the very least, more people playing these games could have positive outcomes. They've already had some positive outcomes, and in fact, the current challenge I think both Folded and Aterna are working on is something related to TB, which is a very, it's something we could make big progress on. So it's here now, it's happening. I'm in favor of it, so I encourage you all, if you're good at Sudoku, it's almost like, people playing Sudoku is like this cognitive energy that's just sort of burned off into the atmosphere. Why not harness it into this pursuit of a common good, right? So I also have some idea for some new game and education ideas. As I said earlier, I really think it's the cell signaling level. That's something I wouldn't mind working on, right? So better gaming education tools at the just one level up in the biological hierarchy. And I think we should have games where we embody the enemy more directly. I mean, it's fun to blow things up, right? In computer, I think it's kind of fun to blow stuff up on a computer game, right? So I want to blow up cancer. I don't like cancer. I want to kill cancer, and I think we should have games where we're doing that. That's my argument. All right, so, but again, even if we don't kill cancer, right, games like that could promote scientific literacy. It could enable you, when you go to these very difficult doctor's appointments, to speak in a more intelligent way, which could be very important. It could really make a difference, change your life. If you're aggressive about getting a test that they say you don't need, say, no, I need it, and then you could live or die from that. All right, and then this is very much moonshot kind of stuff. This relates to some of the stuff I've been doing with Daniel. I think it's interesting to look at the history of problem-solving psychology, right? Like chimps getting together, and there's the banana, or Lost episodes, you may remember this, right? You get the stuff, the chimps will put together a bunch of boxes and go up and get the bananas. or use a stick or a tool. And there's insight problems, and there's search problems. There's a whole sort of complicated hierarchy of approaches to problem solving in psychology. And I'm interested in the psychology on that, and as a philosopher, the phenomenology of it. What is the sort of conscious experience of solving problems? And I actually think we can maybe reverse engineer that and come up with some new algorithms for sort of problem solving AI. But that's sort of, this is sort of ordered by, you know, the things I'm most likely to do. So this is definitely happening. That's it. Thanks for your attention. I'm happy to entertain questions.